It is echoing. Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get the introductions started. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a very busy time in the semester. I appreciate those of you that took time out of your studying to come down, and especially those of you who came from outside the law school. We really are glad to see you. Just a logistical note, the bookstore is down here with copies of Mr. Hannan's book for sale, so please do stick around, and they can take cash, check, and credit card. No checks, just cash and credit card. So our speaker tonight, as you all know, is Mr. Daniel Hannan, directly in front of me here. He's a member of European Parliament for South East England, a position he's held for over a decade. He's also a regular writer and columnist for The Telegraph, which is a daily newspaper in the United Kingdom. He's written over 10 books, including this one, his latest, and the one immediately prior to that was Why America Must Not Follow Europe. So you might detect the theme. He's a winner of the Bastiat Prize in Journalism, and in 2009 he was the 10th most influential center-right politician, according to the British press. He will be speaking tonight about the themes of his book, and we look forward to hearing him. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Daniel Hannan.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, ladies and gentlemen. You know, you're conventionally supposed to start by saying something nice about the place you find yourself or the people who are here. I had to really struggle to come to Philadelphia. My publishers said, why are you going to waste your time there? There are no conservatives in Philadelphia. No one will buy your book there. I've just come from New York. They said, spend an extra 24 hours here. This is where all the media are. It's where all the TV, you know, you can sell books by doing this. And I said, look, I have to come to Philly for three really important reasons. First of all, how can you write a book about the Anglosphere miracle, about the unique freedoms of the English-speaking peoples without coming here? This is the Mecca of the Anglosphere, and the Kaaba stone at the center of it, the place that we would all stand and face and pray to 5 times a day if we were spiritually inclined, is that modest brick old courthouse building where the Declaration and then the Constitution were signed. I have some family in this town, and thank you to the 4 of my cousins who have come tonight. It's great to see them in the audience. And I've been coming on and off since I was a kid. It's a city that means a great deal to me. My parents were married here in the town hall. And I've seen it transformed. You know, I can remember when downtown Philly was not a very salubrious place to go. And now it's beautiful. And that's private industry. President Obama, he didn't build that. That was the market, which was great. And it's fantastic. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, look, the Federalist Society is promoting the things that hold a country together, right? A society is not a random aggregation of individuals. A nation is made up with common stories. And any organization that plays its part in inculcating our values from one generation to the next is playing its role in keeping a nation together. You have a unique patrimony. You won the first prize in the lottery of life, all of you, whether you know it or not. So it's great from that point of view to be able to come and support the work of the Federalist Society. The third reason is this. I've got a new cousin here. She's 4 months old. She's called Corinna. Now, that may not sound like a big deal. She's my third cousin, but you know, I'm an only child. Both my parents are dead. If you have as little immediate family as I do, a third cousin in Philly is a big deal, believe me. And I am looking forward immensely to meeting her for the first time after this meeting. Now, I don't know very much about how that little child is going to grow up. Okay, she's 4 months old, she's not going to be able to tell me. She could be conservative or liberal, she can be Republican or Democrat, I don't know. But I do know this. She is going to be the heiress to a sublime patrimony, one that distinguishes this country and sets it apart from the run of humanity. And I'll tell you something else. Unless she's very unusual, she'll take it completely for granted, the way I do and the way you do. So stop for a moment and think of how unusual are the freedoms that we enjoy in the English-speaking world. The great temptation of our time, because we can all be blasé about the familiar, the great fallacy of our era is to assume that all the things that we take to be comfortable and rational and modern, such as regular elections and personal liberty, and equality between men and women, and uncensored newspapers, and free contract, and jury trials, and habeas corpus, that these things are somehow the natural condition of an advanced society. That any country will get there once its people become educated enough and wealthy enough. History tells a different story. You don't have to go back very far to find a time when those freedoms were almost wholly confined to the Anglosphere, to the community of free English-speaking democracies. On the 10th of August, 1940, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met on the deck of HMS Prince of Wales off Newfoundland. It was the longest walk of FDR's presidency. Up until then, in a way that is literally unimaginable today, the press had contrived to hide the fact of his polio from the electorate. Photographs had always shown him seated or standing unaided. But on this occasion, invited by the British Prime Minister to join him on board, he was determined to rise, literally, to the moment. Supported by his son on one side, by a naval officer on the other. And leaning heavily on his cane, he walked across the deck while the band struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. Churchill was trying to draw the United States into the war. In August 1941, Roosevelt had gone about as far as he could within the neutrality that was decreed by the founders and had been reinforced by a number of specific legislative acts in the 1930s. He'd made available bases, he'd made available money, he'd shared facilities with the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. But Churchill knew that in order to make the US ready to take that last step, he had to show the affinity, the deep cultural roots that bound the English-speaking peoples together. And so he had choreographed what happened next with exact care. It happened to be a Sunday morning. And so the crews of the two vessels, the USS Augusta, which had carried FDR, and HMS Prince of Wales, were paraded jointly for a religious service. Churchill had chosen the hymns himself and the readings. From Joshua 1, as I was with Moses, so shall I be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage. And afterwards, exultantly, the Prime Minister declared the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. Now, when he said the same ideals, he wasn't making some bland generalization about being the good guys. Constitutional freedom was confined to a tiny number of countries. Think of how the world looked from the perspective of August 1941. Across the whole of the Eurasian landmass, there was one type of authoritarian regime or another. And nobody in those days saw capitalism or freedom or democracy as progressive, modern, coming ideas. On the contrary, you look at how both the Nazis and the communists described it. They always used the same adjectives. They always called it decadent Anglo-Saxon liberalism. And the reason they called it decadent is because it looked from the perspective of 1940 as though that was finished. It wasn't just that countries had had their parliamentary systems overthrown by invaders. I mean, a small number of them had. France and Scandinavia and so on. But there was a much longer list of countries in the world at that time which had turned to autocracy internally, without needing to be occupied. Poland and Romania and Austria and Spain and Portugal and Latvia and Estonia, almost all of Eurasia, from Seoul and Vladivostok to Brest and Lisbon. Nobody would have then put money on our system being the victorious one. It seemed logical that a system that elevated the individual over the herd, rather than the other way around, would be the weaker. 1941 was the height of the second of the three great conflagrations that pitted individualist systems against statist ones. The list of countries that were on the right side in all of them in the 20th century, the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War, is not a long one. but it includes all the main Anglophone democracies. Like I say, the ideas that we now take for granted, they were overwhelmingly developed in the language that we're now speaking. And the miracle of our age is that we were able to export these values to take root elsewhere. At this stage, someone in the audience will be thinking, yeah, there's another Brit coming and telling us that the Brits invented everything, it's smug, it's triumphalist, it's arrogant, it's racist. The brilliant thing about Anglosphere values is they take root anywhere with the right cultural assumptions. Right? The Anglosphere is why Bermuda is not Haiti. The Anglosphere is why Hong Kong is not China. The Anglosphere is why Singapore is not Indonesia. If you have the rule of law and personal freedom, the rest follows. There'll be some other of you thinking, well, this is all a bit odd. I mean, here we are in Philadelphia, capital of the revolution. Surely these are the American exceptional story. Wasn't our republic founded in a rejection of the British Empire? Didn't Paul Revere rouse the nation by shouting, "The British are coming"? Well, actually, no, that last one, think about it for 30 seconds, you'll realize that would have been an extraordinary thing for him to shout. Okay, 1775, the entire population of the colonies was British. It would have been very eccentric to ride through eastern Massachusetts shouting, "The British are coming," to an entirely British population. There are some eccentric people in Massachusetts. They vote for some odd candidates. But even in Massachusetts, that would be a very curious thing to do. For the record, what he was actually shouting was, "The regulars are coming out." But how that story has been doctored in itself tells us quite a lot about how the history of that whole period has been written. If you go back to the primary sources, clear your minds of what happened afterwards, and look at what the revolutionary leaders were saying at the time, they did not see themselves as radicals. They saw themselves as conservatives. They were not laying claim to new rights, but rather asserting what they had assumed was their patrimony as Englishmen. We've so pushed this out of our mind, we've changed the whole iconography. You look at any Hollywood dramatization of the American Revolution, or you look at any of the great 19th century paintings about it, you will always see people marching under the Stars and Stripes, under the Betsy Ross flag, as I should call it in Philadelphia. That did happen on one or two occasions. But far more common was what was called the Congressional flag, or the Continental flag, which had the British colours in the corner and then the 13 stripes, which exactly summarised what it was that the Patriot leaders thought they were fighting for, namely the assertion, rather than the rejection, of their British birthright. Look at how the founders and the authors of the Constitution here traced back the ancestry of their ideas. Look how far back they searched for the origins. They didn't think that they were plucking fresh new privileges out of the air. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a tradition that they traced back through the English Bill of Rights in 1689, back through the Magna Carta, back even to the folk right of Anglo-Saxon common law, that extraordinary, beautiful, anomalous system where the law didn't come down from the government, but rather came up from the people. John Adams thought it was the single most important guarantor of freedom. And he was right. What was it that made the Anglosphere different? How do you trace the roots of this exceptionalism? Why did it happen? Okay. Most of the world, for most of history, has lived under one kind of oligarchy or tyranny or another. Right? A medieval European monarchy in its political structure was very similar to modern Zimbabwe, right? It's that the usual pattern is that a group of people get in and they rig the rules so that they and their kids enjoy privileges that other people don't have. Caste, inherited status, systematic looting of resources by the people in power, that is the lot of humanity in most ages, in most countries. We're the exception. How did that happen? What was the little miracle that set our peoples apart? Well, in writing the book, I tried to approach this the way an anthropologist would. The real takeoff of the Anglosphere began from the late 17th century. Yeah, you can trace back differences in property rights and inheritance law and so on, right back to the pre-Norman period in England. But the real takeoff, the development of modern capitalism and contract and modern notions of property rights, that was from the end of the 17th century. So what was it that struck foreign visitors to North America or the British Isles as unusual during that period? What did people in the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, when this takeoff was taking place, what did they remark on as different from the places that they were used to? Well, we had a lot of distinguished visitors, Voltaire and Montesquieu and Tocqueville, and then a host of less well-known people who nonetheless kept journals, wrote letters home. And there are a number of things that cropped up again and again in their writings. They found us a very money-grubbing people, materialist. They weren't usually very polite about it. But they thought we elevated profit over honour, faith, martial glory. You know what? I'm glad we did. Countries that do that tend to be happier places than ones that don't value privacy and freedom. They were struck by our localism, the fact that we elected people who came up county by county instead of sending people out from the central state as prefects or administrators. They were astonished by religious pluralism, not by religious toleration. That existed in lots of places, including some very illiberal places, but equality between different denominations, the freedom for each sect to proselytize. That was pretty much an invention of yours. Something that always hit people when they came from abroad, which of course we take for granted, the geographical remoteness. Other than North America, the Anglosphere is an archipelago, an extended one. English-speaking peoples have tended to live on islands: Great Britain, Ireland, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean countries. It's true that, of course, the US is not an island, but politically it was more isolated than any of the others. And it may not have been geographically isolated, not in the literal sense, but look at Washington's farewell address, reverentially read out every year still in the Senate. Look at what Jefferson said in his first inauguration speech: kindly separated by nature and the ocean from the exterminating havoc of 1/4 of the globe, this was, in its mind, an island country. And why does that matter? Well, if you are geographically remote, you don't need an army except when there's a war. You don't need a peacetime standing force, what our ancestors called a standing army. What does that mean? It means that the government lacks an instrument of internal repression. When the regime wants something from the people, it has to ask nicely by summoning their representatives in a parliament. It's no coincidence that all the oldest continuous parliaments in the world are on islands: England, Iceland, Faroe Islands, Isle of Man, and so on. And then the thing that they really wondered at, the thing that they found most inexplicable, and actually still do, is how a legal system could work without anybody having written the laws down from first principles. I'm a member of the European Parliament. Britain and Ireland are the only two common law countries there. My colleagues there, even now, don't get it. In the Roman law continental tradition, you write a law down in the abstract and then you apply it to a specific case. Right? That's the more usual way you'd expect, right? But somehow, in some bizarre prehistoric miracle that nobody's ever been able to explain, English-speaking societies stumbled on a system where the law grows like a coral, case by case, where the law is the property of the people rather than an instrument of the state, where it is domesticated, where it rests on institutions that make it everybody's business, such as compulsory jury service, such as the local election of magistrates and justices of the peace. That is without precedent in the world. John Adams thought that the liberty of the Republic rested above everything else on the common law of England. He said that before and after the Revolution. Well, One way or another, you put these things together, you ended up with modern capitalism, with a system where people were treated as autonomous agents, able to enter into contracts one with another, rather than having to produce for the people in power. And that really is the Anglosphere miracle. That instead of having to suck up to commissars or kings, instead of having a hierarchical system where your status is determined by tradition, privilege, caste, or circumstances of birth, we are all autonomous units, able to buy and sell and trade our services with other people. And that, put it like that, it sounds bland. It sounds like the dry language of a sociologist, but that has raised the human species to pinnacles of wealth and happiness that we have not known before. I'd like to leave a bit of time for questions, but let me make an important flip side argument here. It's often said that this is a propositional country. And that's true, and that again is not something that was invented in the old courthouse here. England had first started to define itself in a way that was very unusual by European standards, with a civil rather than an ethnic nationality. You could become British by signing up to the values that defined the state. You don't have to go back very far to find, to pluck 100 years ago, you will find that 80% of British subjects at that time were neither white nor Christian, right? This was something which had no equivalent in contemporary Europe. But people were attracted by the values. On 2 occasions in the last century, millions of young men were prepared to cross half the world in order to take up arms for a country that they'd never set eyes on, because they felt that its values were better than the alternative. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Your identity is bound up with your constitution. What makes you American is not any special property in the soil or the sky or the water. People respond to incentives. Sometimes friends say, well, there's an individualist culture here. Yeah, right. But culture does not exist as some disembodied, numinous entity hanging alongside your institutions. Culture is a product of institutions. Your constitution did the job that its authors had in mind. It kept the government small and the citizen commensurately big. If you abandon those structures, if you go down the road which everyone else has gone down, towards higher spending and higher taxes and the centralization of power and the transfer of sovereignty from elected representatives to unelected officials, if you carry on shifting jurisdiction from the 50 states to Washington, from the elected representative to the federal czar, from the citizen to the government, you cease to be American. When your identity is bound up with your institutions, you lose it when you change those institutions. This is not like Japan or Sweden or Ethiopia. Those countries could be monarchies or republics. They could be atheist or they could have state churches. They could be capitalist or communist, but they would still be recognizably the same countries. That's not true here. In a creedal polity, there is a responsibility on every citizen to uphold the values that make it what it is. So let me close, before I move on to questions, let me close with this plea. Honor the vision of your founders. Respect that sublime event that happened just down the road. That extraordinary, providential little miracle that created freedom. Preserve, for my little 4-month-old cousin, the same freedoms that you inherited from your parents. Never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of this nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part. Thank you. Yes, please.
So I'm wondering, based on your study of history, what advice you might have for a person, say, like Eric Pascal, who's obviously trying to strengthen civil society in Russia, a place that has, some legacy, so you hear undeveloped civil societies where rule of law is oftentimes one of the big one over
Sure. I would say that it comes down to the rule of law as a guarantor of private ownership and free contract. Everything else is a bonus that will come later. Democracy, constitutions, all that, that's great. Okay? But if you have to choose between democracy and the rule of law, that is, as you say on this side of the Atlantic, that is a no-brainer. You can have the rule of law and the other things will follow. But if you have democracy without the foundation of a civic society based on property rights, it descends into mob rule. And that, in fact, is more or less what happened in post-Soviet Russia. Unbelievably, to this day, you still don't have private land ownership, not in any meaningful sense. Land is all leased from, farmland is leased from the state. As Adam Smith observed, if you give a man a 7-year lease on a garden, he'll turn it into a desert. But if you give him the freehold on a desert, he'll turn it into a garden. The beginning has to be the right to buy and sell with an independent judiciary to arbitrate the decision, so that the individual, when he feels he has a dispute with his neighbour, can bring those disputes before the court with a reasonable hope of redress, rather than doing what happens in most of the world, rather than what happened in my native South America, which is you phone your friend who knows the general. Right? And that is the usual thing, even in some EU countries. So emphasize the rule of law and property rights rather than anything else. In fact, how far we've drifted from this can be inferred from the way we covered the series of revolutions and events that are now called the Arab Spring. In Western media, this was all triggered by some desire for democracy, some determination to get rid of autocrats. Well, of course, those were genuine motives for people. But what was it that actually sparked the rising? It was the self-immolation of that Tunisian trader who'd had his scales taken away and been forbidden by a corrupt policeman to trade in the market because he wasn't paying the bribes. Right? This was a revolution for capitalism, for want of a better shorthand. Revolution for property rights and free contract. If we'd had that, maybe it would have worked out a lot better than it did. Yeah?
First of all, I'd just like to say I really enjoyed the article in the journal.
Great question, thank you. Oh, sorry, there's more. Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
Two quick questions. First of all, curious how you see this dynamic playing out in a country historically like Australia, which started off with rule of law, obviously, but perhaps not a lot of individual freedom as a penal colony. And then, second of all, thinking to the history of European capitalism, my impression was that the Dutch East India Company was one of the big things that kind of pushed that into Europe, and even though it had a much smaller population than England, it made the Netherlands far richer at the time. And curious to see,
Right.
wonder how that affected.
Thank you. Two really good questions there, and I'll take them in order. It is a paradox, isn't it? I mean, if you were looking for the leaders of the Anglosphere now, you wouldn't name either the British or American heads of government. If the free world has leaders now, it's Steve Harper in Canada and Tony Abbott in Australia. And you're right, there is a paradox there. Australia began as a spillover for Britain's undesirables, and has now become one of the freest and wealthiest and most successful countries on earth, and has outpaced both your country and mine recently. I mean, it's enjoyed wealth and growth in the last 15 years beyond what it saw in the gold rush. How did that happen? Well, you come back to property. A lot of the people who had been transported were transported for what we would nowadays regard as fairly trivial offences, basically shoplifting in a number of cases. But, as I said in my main remarks, reverence for property is an unusual Anglosphere characteristic, one that distinguished us from most other places. And such was the penal system in the 18th and 19th centuries that literally shoplifting could get you, or pickpocketing could get you 7 years transportation. But these were not, if you like, an underclass. These were generally people who had had no opportunity because of rural poverty, or in some cases, slum poverty in the British Isles. At the end of their sentences, they were allowed to farm. They were allowed freehold land, and an economy quickly developed, initially based on sheep farming, but then with all of the secondary industries that come along following that. And rather like the frontier here, Australians grew into their new home. there was unlimited land. People who could not have dreamed of having freehold in the overcrowded old country were suddenly able to have vast estates. And they lived up to it. Tocqueville had a lovely expression when he was talking about the US. I mean, he's often quoted as a witness to American exceptionalism. Quoted, but obviously not very widely read, because right at the beginning of democracy in America, he says, each of the people who came to the New World carried with them the characteristics of the old country, whether they were French or Spanish or English. And he has that lovely phrase, the American is the Englishman left to himself, which I think applies pretty well to Australia as well. People grew into the new country, and of course it then led to this otherwise inexplicable paradox that the spillover country became an intensified Britain, and has been a close friend and ally of the rest of the Anglosphere, has fought in every modern war alongside the US. Yeah, the Netherlands, what an extraordinary thing. I couldn't help, as I was writing this book, to realizing that the Dutch had kept pace pretty much uniquely with the English-speaking peoples in the development of individualism, property rights, and representative democracy. Nowhere else really in Europe did. And you're right, in one important regard they beat us to it. If you define modern capitalism by the twin institutions of limited liability and the joint stock venture, right, the Dutch got there just before us. By the way, the fact that we were moving in parallel was not coincidental. For most of human history, sea travel was safer, faster, and cheaper than land travel. So there was a nexus between the Netherlands and the eastern counties of England, which were the most capitalist and the most radical and the most politically democratic. They were closer to each other in a way than either of the coastal communities were to their own inland towns. Why didn't the Anglosphere miracle happen in the Netherlands? Sheer accident of geography. I mentioned earlier how important it was that we were an island. Well, after 1689, the Netherlands and England were under the same crown, and Scotland were under the same crown, under William III. The Netherlands then exhausted itself. The Netherlands occupies a low-lying, almost indefensible plain. Both England and the Dutch Republic fought a series of wars against expansionist authoritarian France. The Netherlands exhausted itself in those wars defending its territory. And by the beginning of the 18th century, the big Dutch banks and the big Dutch trading houses were migrating from Amsterdam to London, and it was all over. So the merest accident of geography, otherwise we'd all be speaking Dutch now, and I'd be making the same argument. Well, in Dutch, we'd make lots of funny guttural noises, but it would be the same argument. Yeah, guy at the back there.
I have two related questions. The first is, doesn't your argument about freedom somewhat belie the fact that, like, in this, especially early American or British democracy, was premised on racialized hierarchy that dispossessed of like a racial underclass, or was focused on aided dispossession, and different contractual frameworks were allowed or facilitated that dispossession for parties who were not really on equal playing fields. And my second kind of related point is that doesn't a society that's focused only on contract rights perpetuate that dispossession? I mean, I'm thinking about Supreme Court cases that eventually had to overturn racialized covenants in different property cases. So shouldn't government exist to overturn contracts that we perhaps view as offensive?
Thank you. Look, no country is perfect, and perfection is not of this life. So you can find in the story of the US or Britain or any other country things which from a modern perspective are discreditable. But it's bad history to judge past generations by our standards rather than by the standards of the world as it then stood. The really relevant question is, where was doing a better job? Where was there a freer society? Where was there a more equal society? A place where individuals were more equal under the law? Was it in contemporary Russia, in contemporary Africa, in contemporary China? It's so easy to discredit any figure by saying, oh, look at what Churchill said about India, or look at what, Jefferson owned slaves or whatever. Right, it's true. But against whom are they to be judged? If we're looking at where freedom developed, you have to give the story in its entirety. So yeah, mention the segregation, 3/5 of a human being, all of that. But if you're going to do that, also tell the other side of the story. which is the price that people were prepared to pay in order to live up to the ideals that had inspired the Republic. Hypocrisy just means failing to live up to your ideals, right? That's what a society without hypocrisy would be, by definition, a society without ideals, because we're all imperfect. Hypocrisy means you fall short of what you'd ideally like. But it also means you're trying to do better. And the story of the elimination, first of slavery, and then of official and unofficial segregation, was a story of people trying to live up to the ideals of the foundation. It's very striking when you read Martin Luther King's speeches that he doesn't argue in universal language. He says, this is America. Again and again we have to live up to the promise of freedom, and we will win in the end, because the basis of America is freedom. In other words, you could say the system worked. It inspired people to do what they were meant to do rather than what was easy or convenient. The same is true of the UK. I mean, you find me a country that did more to eliminate slavery. Slavery was common in every human society from the moment at least from the moment we had agriculture 6,000 years ago. You won't find a part of the world where it didn't exist. It existed in Mesoamerica, in pre-Columbian South America. It existed in Africa, in Arabia, in China, everywhere. It was, and in Europe. So every single person in this room is descended from slaves. And every single person in this room is descended from slave owners, right? The population of the world is such that those are incontrovertible facts. What made us different? Well, we were prepared to spend decades and invest blood and treasure in extirpating this foul business. Not for any diplomatic gain, certainly not for any financial gain. Even when we were at war with Napoleon, in a life and death struggle for our independence and our survival, we were diverting Royal Navy ships to chase down slavers in the mid-Atlantic because it was the right thing to do. So if you're going to tell that story, by all means, but it's only fair to balance it by looking at the other side of the ledger, to look at what people did to live up to their ideals. As to the idea of contract, I'll come back to the point I made earlier about the autonomy of the individual before the law. There was a British Prime Minister, long-serving British Prime Minister in the 20s and 30s called Stanley Baldwin. Very pragmatic, undoctrinaire guy. Towards the end of his life, in an interview, he was asked, was there any thinker, any philosopher who influenced you? And slightly surprisingly, because he was not a very ideological guy, he said, yes, as a young man, I was immensely influenced by the ideas of Sir Henry Maine, who taught me to see the whole of human history in terms of the move from status to contract. And then he paused, frowning, and said, or was it the other way around? And I mean, it's a nice story. It demonstrates how even the most amazing insight can become stale through repetition. Just think of what that means. Status to contract. The usual lot of humanity. Like I said, a medieval European monarchy would have been very different, very similar to a modern third world kleptocracy. The usual status of humanity is people get into power. They're rapacious. Land is the only source of wealth. They make sure that they keep it, and they make sure that their kids keep it. And in order to make sure that their kids keep it, they start having rules that distinguish their family from other people's. And that's the basis of caste, aristocracy, special privileges. You had it in the Inca societies, you had it in the apparatchik communist society. That is the usual thing. In one sentence, in his fumbling way, Stanley Baldwin got to the root of Anglosphere exceptionalism. Moving from status to contract implies equality before the law. And I'm sorry, that is incompatible with the government then stepping in and saying you will be treated differently because of the circumstances of your birth. The essence of equality for everybody, including racial equality, but it's the same in any other capacity, is we gave everybody the right to be treated the same way. And I'm afraid it's not now compatible with that to say, well, some people should be treated differently. Yeah, I'll let you come back, sure.
I'd rather respond to your second point. The Supreme Court, for instance, in Shelley v. Kramer, threw out contracts that upheld racial covenants that would have stopped minorities from buying homes. So, for instance, you can throw out contracts for repugnancy principles to empower the disenfranchised, which, obviously contract theorists would see as stepping on the rights of contract
Sure, because perfection is not of this life. Of course, you can find examples of something working out with negative consequences. That's absolutely true. That isn't a good enough reason to say that, in general, the state should be stepping in and regulating contract, or, let's be honest about this, defining people differently by race, which is the implication of what that is. Otherwise, it would say anyone can sign a contract with anyone else. Once you start doing that, you look at where that can end. Right? One of the things that was unusual was the early level at which, in English-speaking societies, race was abolished as a legal concept, except in South Africa. That really is unusual. I know we like to beat ourselves up about this. I was born in Lima, Peru. My parents died recently. I was looking through some of the paperwork. In 1948, there was a identity card of my grandmother's which records race, white. Okay? That was the normal thing to give people different legal categorization. Now, I'm incredibly proud of the battle that people fought to say everyone should be treated the same. The law should be colorblind, and indeed blind between status, economic status, sex, whatever. You can't then say, but because I favor this outcome, I'm just going to tweak it a little bit and say that it's okay to recognize race as a legal category. You can, but you're opening the door to an awful lot of institutionalized discrimination down the road, and you won't then be able to argue against it on principle because you've conceded the big issue. Yeah.
You kind of made two kind of general arguments that there's some tension between. One is that this idea of freedom and capitalism is at least historically unique to the Anglo-Saxon world. On the other hand, to be an American, I think to be British, all you need to do is be capitalism and freedom, and that's why immigration from India is kind of really great. And I think a potential problem with that is that not everybody in the world accepts these principles, and that liberty and capitalism can then lead to globalism and immigration with people who don't support those ideas. And so I'm just wondering how you kind of reconcile this problem of whether America is really a creedal, how you can reconcile being a creedal nation with the concern that this can be used to undermine. And in your country, I know, I think it was Andrew Nettle, the labor secretary, explicitly said, we are going to use immigration to undermine conservatism. I mean, well, after the fact, and he explicitly said that. So, how do you reconcile those two?
I'm basically optimistic about the capacity of your country and mine to assimilate people. Because I basically think that with all its flaws, ours is a better model than any rival. Not because it's perfect, but you find me a place where people are happier and freer than under our system of government. And the reason why people choose to come to a country generally is because they prefer it to the place they've left. And it's a big thing to uproot yourself, leave your friends and family, cross the oceans and set up a new life somewhere where you don't know anywhere, right? Where you don't know anyone. That is not, as the prayer book says of marriage, is not to be entered into lightly, wantonly, or it's a big decision. Someone's prepared to do that. By and large, that's a good starting point. Someone's got the energy and the courage to do that. It's a good starting point. Something you can't help noticing in this country, if you read the history, is that every single generation of Americans has taken the view that immigration has been a really good idea up until now, but now it's different. And there's always a superficially plausible reason for it to be different. But up until now they were all English speaking. Yeah, but up until now they were all Protestant. Up until now they were all white. There's always some apparently new thing. And you know what? Every immigrant has made this country more American. It's worked. The system has taken people from every continent and archipelago, and it's made them free, successful, and by and large, patriotic people who are happy to be here. And so it's a pretty good record. You don't have to look very far at other Western countries, in countries very close to mine when I travel around Europe, where you have completely alienated populations which feel almost nothing in the sense of loyalty to the state. So it's, I'm going to stand here and just make the case for optimism. We always seem to act in the expectation of some looming catastrophe. And every generation always does. And the cause of the catastrophe, well, that varies. It can be global cooling or global warming, or it could be bird flu or swine flu or nuclear holocaust or drugs-resistant superbugs or asteroid strikes or overpopulation or underpopulation or Islamization or the debt crisis. The issue changes, but the argument is always the same. This time it's going to be different. It never has been yet. Life keeps getting better. We are living happier, longer, more fulfilled lives than our grandparents would have thought possible. Yeah.
I see your point. It seems that it's coming everything back again into economics, where you say America is a wealthy country. People are coming for the money, so they can make the money. It doesn't necessarily follow that they necessarily tie the wealth to this increase in living. And when you talk about, like increase in freedom, someone in Macedonia had a much greater standard of living than America in 1790. Doesn't mean that they were more free.
Oh, sure. By the way, I wouldn't call it increase in money. What we really mean by increase in money is increase in leisure time, right? I mean, what do we actually mean by wealth? You have the dishwasher, it means you can go for a nice walk. You don't have to work every day of the week except Sunday. That means you can play with your kids because you can drive to work instead of taking the tram. That means you can listen to Beethoven, right? This is not about, there's this bizarre idea in politics that conservatives get pleasure out of bank accounts. I mean, believe me, I spend lots of time